time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith.
Is that not the start of the slippery slope?
It's very much so.
And the big moral questions of the day.
I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Coronation is an event that has remained virtually unchanged for 1,000 years.
And we invite you to join us here on GB News for this historic event.
All next week, we'll be talking to you in towns and cities across the country.
Building up to the main event on Saturday.
From pageantry at the palace to unearthing the history of this ancient ritual.
Come celebrate with us.
The coronation of King Charles III, Saturday, May the 6th. Join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Welcome along to Neil Oliver Live on GB News TV and on radio. Coming up on the show this evening, I'll be joined by the MP Andrew Bridgen, who was expelled from the Conservative Party this week for his remarks about the COVID vaccine. And I also have the amazing privilege of having some of the actual artefacts discovered on the Mary Rose shipwreck in the studio this evening. All of that, plus plenty of chat with my brilliant panellist, Julie Cook. But first, an update on the latest news from Rory Smith.
Thank you, Neil. The latest from the GB newsroom. The final evacuation flight out of Sudan is expected to take off at any moment. The government earlier agreed to include NHS doctors without UK passports on the last flights out of the country. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden is holding a Cobra meeting in Downing Street discussing the security situation in Khartoum. Well, it's understood around 1,650 people have been evacuated from Sudan, but thousands more British citizens may remain. The government says it will continue to work to bring an end to the conflict between the army and a rival paramilitary group that has killed tens of thousands of people. Great Ormond Street Hospital has been granted exemptions to allow nurses to continue working during the upcoming strike action over the bank holiday. The Children's Hospital expressed concerns about staffing as Royal College of Nursing workers prepare to walk out from 8 p.m. tomorrow until Monday evening in their ongoing dispute over pay. Well, it comes as health workers belonging to the GMB union accepted a 5% pay offer from the government yesterday. Union officials will now vote to accept the offer at a meeting of the NHS Staff Council next week. Labour is promising to invest in more teachers who are specialists in their subject if they win the next general election. Labour analysis of government figures show there are gaps in expert teacher roles in state schools across England. Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson says schools are scrambling to fill those places, meaning standards are not as high as they should be for all children. She told GB News that under Labour, the challenges to teacher recruitment and retention will change.
Over the course of the last decade, the government has presided over recruitment failure and a real challenge across our schools. So what schools are having to do at the moment when they're scrambling to find teachers to cover lessons is to call upon non-specialists to deliver those lessons because of the massive challenges that we're seeing around teacher recruitment and retention. And under Labour, that will change. We'll make sure that all children have access to specialist provision and that we deliver more teachers by ending those tax breaks on private schools.
Staying with education now, and a school is set to take Ofsted to court for not following the correct procedures during a review. The Queen Emma Primary School in Cambridge was downgraded to inadequate, the lowest possible rating. While waiting for the Ofsted report to be published, head teacher Ruth Perry was informed of the result and took her own life. In a speech to the National Association of Head Teachers, her sister, Professor Julia Waters, condemned the watchdog and called for Ofsted inspectors to hand in their badges.
When 3 Ofsted inspectors pronounced on frankly flimsy grounds that Ruth's leadership and therefore her school were inadequate. The injustice of that one-word judgment destroyed Ruth's career, her world and her sense of self. I won't give up until Ofsted is radically reformed to place the welfare of teaching staff as well as of children at its heart.
3 new photographs of the King and Queen Consort have been released ahead of next week's coronation. The images were taken in the Blue Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace last month. One shows the couple standing together in front of a portrait of King George V at his coronation in 1911. The Queen Consort is wearing the late Queen's pearl drop earrings and a pearl necklace from her private collection. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now though, it's back to Neil.
I think a big step towards understanding how the world works today comes with realising the goodies and baddies just ain't what they used to be. From the Godfather movie and Michael Corleone, we learned that the pursuit of power is not personal, that it's strictly business. And from another movie, The Usual Suspects, we learned that to seize power, you just need the will to do what the other guy wouldn't. So stress-tested and time-hardened are these truths, us little people are invited to hear them declared on the screen. The truth is so embedded in our everyday reality, courtesy of Hollywood and the rest of the media, they don't care whether we know it or not. After all, what are we going to do about it? All the time I hear people starting sentences with the words, they can't or they won't. In that context, they means the people with power, those manoeuvring to increase and consolidate that power. I always reply, they can, and because they can, sooner or later they will. I mentioned The Godfather, the epic about organised crime. It's my belief that sometime in the last century, government and business got into bed with organised crime, which is to say, with those with the will to do what the other guy wouldn't. I think that alliance has made all the difference. It's why I don't believe the running of the world is any longer about the same old goodies and baddies. For those with power, it's strictly business. For those who want to hold on to that power, by now it's also about self-preservation. Last week, the news was dominated by civil war in Sudan. I'd been waiting for the next distraction after COVID and climate crisis and war in Ukraine, and there it was. Just as with Ukraine, when the news broke about Sudan, I had to look at a map to remind myself exactly where it was. It sits on the Red Sea on Egypt's southern border. As usual, it turns out geography matters. Sudan recently concluded a deal to let Russia base warships, including nuclear warships, in a port on the Red Sea. Warm water ports have been part of the Russian dream for hundreds of years. The United States don't like the idea of Russia in Sudan, not one little bit. This week, online news channel Redacted reported on recent events there. In August last year, while the deal was brewing, the US appointed an ambassador to Sudan for the first time in a quarter of a century. The following month, that ambassador warned Sudan not to finalise any deal with Russia. In November, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Sudan to consider, quote, US support for the rapid formation of a civilian-led transitional government, close quote. In December, the US brokered what they like to call a framework agreement between Sudan's military leaders and pro-democracy parties. In February, Sudan went ahead with the deal with Russia. A few days later, the Biden administration sent $200 million in humanitarian aid to Sudan. And in March, Victoria Nuland visited Sudan to discuss democracy. By this month, conflict had escalated between Sudanese armed forces and a breakaway paramilitary group. Last week, the US began evacuating its people. Victoria Nuland is US Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs, the same Victoria Nuland who in February 2014, while frustrated by EU hesitancy about opposing Putin, said, "F the EU," except she used the whole word, while on the phone to US Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt, a call that was recorded and leaked. Nuland later apologised. Nuland's faux pas came during the febrile time that followed Ukraine's then-President Viktor Yanukovych's ill-fated attempts to keep on side with both Washington and Moscow, to ride two horses with just one bottom. He was tempted by NATO and EU membership, but in the end, Putin, in the manner of the aforementioned Godfather, evidently made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And so all the way back in 2014, the fuse was lit for war. Ukraine is devastated. Hundreds of thousands are dead. Infrastructure shattered. Many billions of dollars, pounds and euros have already been blown there. The majority of the weapons sent there can't be traced. Now US companies are gearing up to extract Ukrainian oil. Transnational corporation BlackRock will invest in the Great Rebuild. What goes around comes around, eh? Where there's muck and death, there's brass. And down in Sudan, there's more to know about what appears to be going on there as well. Sudanese journalist David John Bouakali has described the two factions of the Sudanese army at war with one another, one led by Lieutenant General Muhammad Hamdan, head of a paramilitary group called Rapid Support Forces, the other by the Sudanese Army Chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. According to Bouakali, the conflict is, quote, not happening in a vacuum. He calls it nothing less than a proxy war between Russia and America, and calls on the Sudanese and indeed all the peoples of Africa to speak up and demand that, quote, America and Russia get their hands off Africa. The days of the shenanigans of the Cold War are completely over, he said, and they cannot fight proxy wars in Africa at the expense of innocent African lives. The puppet masters must stop their evil, diabolical games. For those still thinking war is about protecting people and advancing democracy, I say maybe it was once, but that now it's strictly business at our expense. It's not just the US and Russia dabbling in Sudan, it's Saudi Arabia too. Saudi Arabia is tight with China, apparently, and yet in Sudan they're on side with the US in seeking to broker a peace deal between the warring parties. Strictly business, I suspect. Leave the gun, take the cannoli. Remember the bioweapons labs in Ukraine, the ones that weren't there, and then were, scores of them, right up against the Russian border and backed with US dollars, amid talk of gain of function. Turns out there are bioweapons labs in Sudan as well, supported by the World Health Organization, Brazil, China, the United Arab Emirates, Save the Children, the World Bank, the United Nations. One lab has focused everyone's attention. It's in Khartoum, and in its stores are vials of cholera, measles, polio, and other infectious diseases. It seems to be under the control of people the US does not care for. What is it with bioweapons labs and insecure countries? Why are international interests so often involved in bioweapons research conducted in countries that turn into war zones? Back in 1998, the Clinton administration bombed the bejesus out of a factory in Sudan that made half of all the medicines upon which the people of Sudan depended. It was called Al-Shifa, in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. Clinton's bombs were claimed to be reprisals for Osama bin Laden's earlier attacks on targets in Kenya and Tanzania. The factory was flattened, killing 1 and injuring 11. Clinton's people said Al-Shifa was making VX nerve agent and that the owners had links to Al-Qaeda, except they almost certainly didn't. Officials later conceded there was no proof of production or storing of nerve gas or of links to Osama bin Laden. In any event, in 2006, the US stepped into Sudan with private pharma companies to fill the void left by the unlawful bombing of Al-Shifa. It's not personal, you might have said. It's strictly business. Back in the early 2010s, it was estimated Sudan was sitting on as much as 7 billion barrels of oil. There are largely unexploited reserves too of gold, uranium and iron ore, along with much more mineral wealth besides. So much money to be made. The scale and influence of the military-industrial complex is almost too great to be contemplated. Millions of dollars are spent lobbying politicians of all stripes. Lucrative arms contracts are awarded. Endless wars are embarked upon. The defence spending of the US is bigger than that of the 15 next biggest national defence budgets in the world combined. Every year, some few US politicians and others ask to see accounts for where and how those many hundreds of billions of US taxpayers' dollars are spent. And every year, the Pentagon somehow fails to provide the requested answers and data. They have failed the last 5 audits. Many of those billions remain unaccounted for. It's all a rotating wheel of spend and profit. The missiles and bullets fly in faraway countries, people die, and the profits fly back just as fast into the coffers of contractors like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. Much of the survival of the idea in the minds of many that the running of the world is about the same old goodies and baddies is down to the mainstream media that perpetuates the myth. But that mainstream media is dependent in turn for its survival on the billions of dollars funneled their way by governments and those same vested interests of the military-industrial complex. If the mainstream media don't tell the right stories, push the approved narrative at the plebs, then the money flow stops. Another movie I think about a lot is Cool Hand Luke, the embodiment of the unbreakable man, played by Paul Newman. No matter what the man tries to do with chains and beatings and the solitary confinement of the box, Luke won't give in. Could it be that simple then? Don't give in. Could it be that all we have to do is emulate the spirit of Cool Hand Luke, that determined stubbornness in defiance of all coercion? US writer and filmmaker James Webb, also one of the most decorated Marines of the Vietnam War, has written about the culture of the Scots-Irish, those migrants who did so much to shape the culture of the United States. He has described the Rednecks, and that name is a badge not of shame but of glowing pride, as the sons and daughters of the Scots-Irish who, from century to century and millennium to millennium, defied, one after the other, the Romans, the Normans, the English aristocracy in Scotland and then in Ireland, then all of those elitists' descendants in the fledgling USA, as well as every other uncomprehending fool that ever got up in the faces of iron-hard people forged in one furnace after another, they never have and surely never will submit to any top-down authority that seeks to have them set aside their beliefs, their independence, their way of life, and meekly to do what they're told. In a card game in the movie, the eponymous Luke has useless cards but plays them with all that's needed, which is to say with guts and guile. When he wins and his opponent voices his astonishment about being beaten by a hand full of nothing, Luke says, "Sometimes nothing can be a real cool hand." Eric Hoffer was an American philosopher and writer. He wrote, "Again and again I come across the assertion that a society cannot grow and thrive without culturally superior stratums which generate the impulse towards excellence and greatness. There is evidence on every hand that the vigour and health of a society are determined by the quality of the common people rather than the cultural elite. Those of us common people opposing the dictatorial nonsense by the elite have a whole lot more than nothing, and it's a real cool hand. We have everything we need because we have right and we have the truth. Are there any goodies in charge in the world anymore? Sometimes it feels like it's not turtles all the way down, it's baddies. For those baddies, it's strictly business. Here's the thing, unlike Michael Corleone of The Godfather, I say it is personal, 100% personal, and I say the fate of the world is about good and bad, is about what's right and wrong, and that it's long past time to pick a side. Joining me tonight, the journalist and author Julie Cook. Julie, goodies and baddies, do you think they're who they were, or what do you think of my assertion that it's a little bit more complicated than that?
First of all, your monologue, as ever, hits it right on the head. I don't know who's good and bad anymore. I don't think I have for a long time. Particularly with Sudan, it's as you said, where is Sudan? We don't hear about Sudan here, do we? You had to look it up on a map before this show. I was thinking, when did I last hear about Sudan? You know, it's not something we talk about. And of course, it's follow the oil, follow the money, follow the gold. And my fear is, you know, we've destroyed Iraq, we've destroyed Afghanistan. Is this the next place that we're going to destroy and rape the land for what it has in the name of something else? And that's my fear. So I think Sudan is just another place we're going to destroy. That's the way it seems to me.
I think it's a lot easier to make sense of things if you set aside the notion of who are the goodies and who are the baddies. It is business. For the longest time now, it's just been business.
Yeah, and I think as we've become more and more a world of there isn't really political elites anymore, is there? There's just conglomerates, there's just money, there's just big business, and that is our new ruling class. And I think that's, as you say, that's the new reality. And there is no one really to look up to anymore. There are no sort of public figures of any worth to warrant that sort of admiration anymore. We can't look up to or decide who's good and bad when it's just simply a global elite of money-making. And that's, as you say, follow the money back to Sudan. Look where the money is, and it's all about that.
Yes, we're on a break already. Coming up next, we'll be joined by Andrew Bridgen. The Conservative Party has expelled him after a tweet mentioning the Holocaust in the same sentence as the vaccine rollout was found to have breached lobbying rules. You're watching Neil Oliver live on GB News, the People's Channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. My first guest tonight is Andrew Bridgen, MP for North West Leicestershire. Mr Bridgen has been kicked out of the Conservative Party for remarks he made in relation to the harms done by the products marketed as vaccines for COVID. He's one of a handful, barely a handful, of MPs who have questioned the official line that the products are safe and effective. He joins me now to talk about why he's taken this path. Thanks for coming in, Andrew. Going against the grain, running against the official narrative, it comes with a lot of grief. What did you see and experience that persuaded you to take this path?
Given my qualifications in biological sciences, I think I'm probably one of the MPs who's qualified to research all this, and I wasn't comfortable about the whole pandemic response, the lockdowns, the Project Fear against my constituents, and I started speaking to scientists and doctors whom themselves had been cancelled, and became aware of what was really going on, that the vaccines are not safe or effective, and for most people are completely unnecessary. And then I got very worried about the narrative. I could have spoken out earlier, probably 12 months earlier, but it was when the MHRA went to the government and asked for permission to extend the vaccines down to babies of 6 months, and then I felt I had to speak out, and thankfully the government reversed on that.
What is it like for you now in Westminster? What's the atmosphere?
It's like being in a sort of parallel universe. Certainly, the elected politicians are not happy with me. They're getting a lot of emails from their constituents which they don't want to answer. But what you have to remember is there's about 4,000 real people who work in Westminster, the cooks, the cleaners, the security guards, the clerks, and they're very, very supportive of my position and have been all the way through.
It seems to me that every MP in the House must have surely been contacted by at least one constituent to raise some kind of question about the vaccine products and the effects that they've had on someone close to them. And yet, when you stood up on your hind legs in the House to ask for your colleagues to come together to debate it, everyone was conspicuous by their absence. How do you rationalise that in a place that's supposed to be the home to spirited debate?
Well, we're always told that we're supposed to speak as elected representatives in the mother of all parliaments without fear or favour. Unfortunately, what we've got in the Parliament now is there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of favour. A large number of colleagues have come to me privately over the last 4 months and given me the nod and the wink and said, yes, you're definitely onto something, don't stop. But that's a long way short of standing next to me in the chamber or actually voting for anything.
What is motivating your colleagues then to remain out of it, to keep their heads down?
I had a meeting with a very senior colleague in the party 4 months ago, and at the end of that, we talked about everything for an hour or so, and he was fully in the picture. At the end of it, he said, Andrew, there's no political appetite for your views on the vaccines at the moment. There may well be in 20 years' time, and you may well be proved correct. And the final warning as I left the room was, you need to bear in mind that you're taking on the most powerful vested interest in the world with all the risks that that entails.
Were you supposed to read between those lines that, like he was, you should be afraid of consequences of going up against or in the face of those vested interests?
I think that was the message, and I think he was being very honest about it. But ultimately, I was elected to look after the interests of my constituents and the wider British public. The emblem of Parliament is a portcullis, which is the last defence of the castle when the drawbridge has been breached, and we're supposed to defend our constituents and the country's best interests. And I couldn't reconcile keeping quiet with those promises I made to my electorate when I took office. And also, you know, I've got a 4-year-old, and I looked at him and no, he wasn't going to be a guinea pig for experimental vaccines, which were of no benefit to him whatsoever, and he'd already had COVID.
Julie, what do you feel? What's your reaction to listening to this testimony?
I think it's frightening that we don't have free speech anymore. I certainly think that. I think having your opinion, Andrew, I don't think you should have then been expelled from a political party for having an opinion. I think that's frightening. I think the reason that certain people are clinging to was the word Holocaust, which, as we've said before, when can you use the word Holocaust and in what context? The trouble with the word Holocaust is it's a very laden, heavy word, and I think that's being used as a distraction for what you're actually trying to say. But I can see why, I didn't take offence at the word Holocaust, but I can see why certain people pegged onto that, focus on that, and see it as that laden word, when actually there's a lot, obviously, to be said for what the reality is, what he's talking about.
Since you raise it, I mean, obviously, Andrew, you were quoting someone else, and in fact, you were quoting a Jewish cardiologist.
On Twitter, apparently you tweet it, you own it, so I can understand that. Yes, I was retweeting the comments of a senior cardiologist who said that the vaccine rollout was the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust, so using that as a timeline, not belittling the Holocaust or denying the Holocaust, but using it as a reference point since. And I was retweeting with that a paper from a doctor of criminology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
I've heard it said more than once that, you know, no good deed goes unpunished. Do you think you're on the receiving end of punishment because you have taken it upon yourself to say what others won't, even though those others know that what you're saying is right?
Yes, and I think it's not only a punishment for me, it's an example for others. If you follow the same line as Andrew Bridgen, you'll get the same treatment. There's a general election coming up in the next 12 months, almost certainly, and you know, colleagues are rather keen to get reselected for their seats. Clearly, I wasn't going to be reselected because I had the whip suspended. Now I've been expelled from the party, and somebody else will be standing as a Conservative candidate in my constituency.
We're going to come back to continue this conversation in a couple of minutes, but another break is upon us, so bear with, and I'll see you again in 2 or 3.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories. Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live, where we're continuing to talk to MP Andrew Bridgen. Andrew, is there a precedent for this? Has a sitting MP been ostracised by the House in this way for a point of principle?
I don't think so. I've made my views on the efficacy and safety of the vaccines clear based on scientific evidence, which I've always, when I've given those speeches, obviously I know it's controversial. I know I'll get picked up if I don't get the science right. My team release a press pack with 32 scientific papers I've quoted in them, and all that happens is that the mainstream media just ignore the speech altogether because they can't take it apart. It is unprecedented for an MP to be expelled effectively for having a view. We're in amazing times. It's not as if mRNA vaccine efficacy was in our manifesto. It wasn't in our manifesto in 2019, which seems a very long time ago now.
We're almost in danger of losing sight of the fact that what you were asking for was a debate about a vaccine injured, and there is no doubt that people have been hurt and killed by the vaccines, and that you wanted a debate about excess deaths. Will that debate that you want ever happen?
It's not happening. I've been asking for 5 months for a debate on excess deaths, which are affecting my constituents and every other constituency, every community across the land. I went down to the Labour end of the tea room and said, come on, guys, if you sign up to this, we'll get this debate. You could stand up in that chamber and say it's all those horrible Tories' fault. They've ruined the NHS. That's why we've got these excess deaths. And they just looked at me blankly and said, you've come to the wrong pub. We don't want to talk about this. And it's not just happening in our parliament. These excess deaths are everywhere where the vaccine has been rolled out. And those debates are not happening in any of those parliaments either. We're in very, very strange times.
Are the consequences just too big? Are those people who've spoken out in favour of and who continue to trot out the stuff about safe and effective, do they just realise that they now just have no option but to double down and keep going, because to admit the mistake would have consequences that they daren't think about?
I think there's some of that. There's certainly some of that. There's a lot of political capital being put behind the vaccine and the rollout, and that's not just in the governing Conservative Party, that's across the whole House of Commons. There was only a handful of us Conservative backbenchers who opposed any of the lockdown responses and the pandemic response measures, and you're seeing it across the world. It's bizarre. It's a travesty of democracy. It's the elephant in the room which no one will talk about.
What about the bigger picture? I've in some respects, I've moved on from COVID and the products marketed as vaccines, because I see them as having been the thin end of a wedge. Do you see a way in which all of this behaviour, this misbehaviour, fits into something that involves, 15-minute cities, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies?
Yeah, well, I don't remember any of those things being in our manifesto in 2019. They certainly they weren't, but they're all coming in, and it's amazing that whatever Klaus Schwab announces that his aspirations are, it's happening across all the so-called democracies of the world at the same time. We're in lockstep with our responses to the pandemic. We can't all excuse them. They didn't all have someone as incompetent as Matt Hancock at the Department of Health. He wasn't running it in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the rest of Europe, was he? But the response was exactly the same. And, if it's cock-up or conspiracy, you're asking us to believe that it's a cock-up in every single democracy about the same issue at the same time. It sounds rather more coordinated than that, doesn't it?
Did you feel that, Julia? Or just ask you, did you think there was a sense in which you were hearing the same words all at the same time all over the world?
Build back better.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree. I mean, I think it was mostly in our country, certainly, a lot of incompetence. I don't think there was an evil master plan from where I'm looking. It looked like just massive incompetence and cock-ups at every step of the way. We mentioned Matt Hancock, and that certainly is true. But yeah, you're right. It does seem very coordinated. It does seem to have happened in all the sort of democratic countries of the world. I feel at the moment, I don't know about you, but I feel that it's almost like Brexit all over again. There's the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and we're all sort of blaming each other at each other's throat. It's another divide and rule thing, I think, and I think that's a worry in itself. You know, as well as fighting the good fight, trying to find out about excess deaths, about, you know, getting proper medical research done into that. How do we stop this divide between us all? It's almost like a civil war of the vaccine and the vaccinated against each other.
What are we to do, Andrew? I mean, what is the point of MPs if they won't debate? And is Parliament itself fit for purpose?
Parliament's not serving the people well at the moment. You know, I've been asking again for a debate for many months on the WHO post-pandemic preparation treaty and also the changes to the international health regulations. I didn't get that. That was only achieved by public petition of 156,000. We had that debate a week or so ago, and it's clear that the opposition parties and the government are going to push this through. And if you thought we were losing sovereignty by being in the European Union, it's got nothing on the powers that Dr. Tedros is going to have at the WHO to call a pandemic and take control of everything that goes on in this country and across the world.
Now, that you have just said is roundly challenged. People say, no, the sovereignty will still rest with the British Parliament. Now, you're shaking your head.
If you read the treaty, I mean, when the original treaties with the WHO were non-binding, I mean, in the new treaty, non-binding is crossed out, and I think it's clause 13A is included, which says that all countries and governments are to comply with the regulations. So you're going to have one person who's not really qualified, and I think if you look at the track record of dealing and advising with the last pandemic, which according to them is still carrying on, we'd still be in a public health emergency of international concern for both COVID and monkeypox, so they'd be keeping the powers. You've got an unelected, unaccountable body, the WHO, who don't pay tax. Them and their families have political immunity from prosecution. I can't think of a more unaccountable world government to having control. And they not only decide when they're going to have an emergency, which could be about the environment or CO2 levels or an animal disease or a risk of a human pathogen, they'll also decide when it's over. And I think it'll be a very long time before they'd ever return powers to our Parliament.
And do you see a future whereby our government, our Parliament, would just submit to the diktats that were coming out of the...
If we agree to these treaty changes, and that will be in the next probably 6 months, we have effectively made our democracy redundant. And there won't be really much point being down in Westminster, because I can just see one pandemic emergency after another, and all powers being taken by the WHO, which is an arm of the UN, and mysteriously, 84% funded by private enterprise again, and individual donations, and that buys them huge lobbying power. We've seen all this with their own health regulators in the UK.
Will you stand again? I mean, because as I understand it, you've been a very popular constituency MP. You know, I hear good things about the standard of living and the way of things in your constituency.
We've come a long way together.
Will you stand as...
I will stand at the next general election, whenever that is, and my future will, as always, be in the hands of my electorate, and that's called democracy.
Yeah. What is the outsized paperclip you're wearing on your lapel?
I had the pleasure to speak a fortnight today in Stavanger in Norway at the sponsored by the Children's Health Defence, and apparently I was given this by the Norwegians. Before the Second World War, they'd invented the paperclip, and they wore it as a sign of resistance to the German occupation during the war years. So they handed me this paperclip and said, "You're a member of the resistance," and I wear it with pride.
Member of the resistance. Andrew Bridgen MP, thank you so much for coming in. I'm glad we had the opportunity to have, a lengthy conversation about what is a subject close to my heart. And one way or another, we have to keep pushing and asking the questions and seeking the answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming up next, we'll be joined by one of the original divers on the wreck of the Mary Rose to talk about what it was actually like raising the ship from the seabed and how a new immersive experience at the museum is now able to show visitors what it would have been like for the divers at the time. We'll also be looking at some of the artefacts recently recovered from the ship. Don't go anywhere.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. The Mary Rose, a purpose-built Tudor warship that saw action across 3 decades, sank in the Solent in 1545. The wreck was found in 1971 and then raised in 1982 in one of the most complicated maritime salvage efforts ever attempted. And all these years later, she's still giving of her secrets, enabling us to understand more and more about the world from which she came. She still attracts crowds to her purpose-built museum in historic dockyards in Portsmouth, and now a new 4D cinema experience voiced by actor Ross Kemp, who recently dived the site himself, will add to the excitement of the experience of being with her. Let's have a look.
Dive the Mary Rose 4D, it's as if you were there. The bubbles come down. I don't want to give it away, but there's smells, the shuddering. You actually feel like you're diving.
I think this 4D experience we've created is fantastic. When I saw this for the first time, I cried because it sort of relived that experience. It will attract people who don't normally go to museums to really get the feel of what it's like diving on the Mary Rose, uncovering things.
Joining me now to talk about the wonder of it all are Alex Hildred, Head of Research and also Curator of Ordnance and Human Remains, and CEO of the Mary Rose Museum, Dominic Jones. Great to have you with me. Great to have these guests with me too. Ross Kemp was. I could understand him being the voice, but I didn't realise that he'd been actually personally involved in the dive.
Yes, he picked up these two objects that we've got. I don't know if
Really?
you can see it, but in here.
Can you lift them out of the tray, maybe?
Yeah.
So what are we dealing with there?
Well, that's a piece of a pot, but that's the sort of thing very,
If you
very
hold it up a
similar to
little
the
bit.
Mary Rose
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah.
And so we will have it properly dated, but it's...
So he's making a serious contribution
Well,
to the...
yes, he is, but this is surface finds, so we obviously aren't excavating at the moment.
Yeah.
And that, just to show the variety, is a pipe stem, a pipe bowl rather,
bowl.
but just to show that we've got later things as well. People think of just the Tudor Mary Rose, but we had to excavate through 2 meters of sediment in some places in order to get to the Tudor layers. So we have got a huge number of objects which are post-Tudor, which are there as well.
To me, the idea of a 4D cinema experience, I'm sure that will add hugely to it all. But it's being with Mary Rose, I think, is a real visceral experience, is it not? It's actually being beside her and knowing that she comes from half a millennium ago.
Well,
I mean, I think you've got the experience of being there and almost sort of touching history and smelling the Mary Rose and looking at the Mary Rose. But then with the Dive the Mary Rose 4D, you get the sense to feel what it was like to dive. And over 500 volunteers, divers. You were one of the divers, Alex, so you get that sense of being with the ship and getting that presence, but also with the 4D, the sense to do the diving as well. So it's kind of a nice bit of both.
I'm looking at that wooden block and struggling to accept that it's as old as you're telling me it is. The condition of it.
Well, that's the same with most of the wood. Unless it's exposed, it's in excellent condition. So, again, the stuff that's closer to the surface and would have been exposed before being covered is not as good. But this is from the rigging area within the hold of the ship. So
what function would that actually have?
That's pulley block for the rigging. So it's part of the rigging. And we've got 12 different types and over 100 individual blocks.
And why does it remain in such condition? I suppose most people would think that wood in water would just get soft and rot away to nothing.
Because the sediments move across the ship, carried by the tides. The sediments, when they went over the Mary Rose when she was on the seabed at first, went through the open gun ports on the side of the ship that was above the seabed and filled it quite quickly. So we've got, the objects from both sides of the ship fell down towards the starboard side, and we've got them in perfect condition.
So when it comes to decay, time was effectively stopped for these pieces?
Absolutely, but not so with iron. So the other object we've got here is actually a ballock knife or a ballock dagger and would have had an iron blade. You can see the staining here.
Right.
It would have been about that long and worn on the right hip.
So where the wooden handle has survived?
The iron blade hasn't. So we've got 66 of these, mostly boxwood, but we've only got one sword which was complete, and that's because it fell when the ship was sinking. It fell under the ship, so it was in the tunnels that were tunneled under the ship. It was found there and in good enough condition, and that's one of the things we're showing with this 4D experience, is the tunnelling experience.
And what's quite nice about the rigging block as well is that's similar to the one that His Majesty King Charles excavated when he was diving. He did over 10 dives with us, and like Ross Kemp, because he's dived, he's in our new 4D, but that's very similar, and he actually excavated one of them himself, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He worked in the rigging area and excavated a block which is absolutely similar to that one.
When Julie and I first met, it was to talk about the Titanic.
I'm just over this because I love maritime history.
Oh, fantastic.
I wrote a book about the Titanic. My great-granddad died on the Titanic, so I love all this. And I'm looking at that thinking someone's hand held that sword and what stories it could tell, and it's just fascinating. It's like it just speaks to you, doesn't it? I just love it. I think it's brilliant.
They were all found except for one amongst the human remains that were found on the ship.
Really?
Yes, I said there were 66 of them, 66, and one of them was found in a chest. The rest were all amongst...
Would that have been... Was there standard issue kit for those kinds of fighting men, or was that something that somebody brought from home or commissioned?
Well, these are... Every person, every man had a sword. Well, not every man had a sword, every man had a knife. And so you would eat with it, you would stab somebody with it.
Right.
Unlike the swords where only gentlemen were supposed to have them. So those are belonging to individuals. We do have issue things like the very long pikes for anti-boarding and bills and the longbows, and you can tell those are straight issued from the from the armories from the Tower of London.
Alex, how does it feel after all these years of such physical closeness to Mary Rose? What's your relationship like with the...
Very personal. A very personal relationship. Every object, you know, I would have excavated something similar to every single one of those. And that one's important, the big jug, because it was found in 2005, so at our last big excavation on the ship, to the very end of it, just showing that even amongst the area of the collapsed bow castle, we've got complete objects like that, which of course is quite...
I mean, it's a fairly rugged piece of ceramic, but nonetheless, after 500 years, that it's all but complete.
Yeah.
The extent to which Mary Rose has looked after everything that was with her is really quite affecting.
Especially the fact that a lot of it is wood and is rarely... I mean, there are many museums which will have similar pieces to that, but it's the wood, the everyday things, the coffee, the Starbucks coffee cups that get thrown away. That is what we've got within the wooden assembly.
So it's the biggest collection of everyday Tudor life in the world. There's nowhere else you can get close to Tudor history than the Mary Rose.
Yeah.
So it's stunning.
Perfectly dated.
Does she still attract the punters? Is she still as popular as she ever was?
Definitely. We had a fantastic Easter, and actually coming out of lockdown, it was brilliant because people discovered what's on their doorstep. But this new experience is about reaching a new audience, trying to get sort of the families and people who wouldn't normally go to a museum just to experience what it's like to dive at the Mary Rose in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, and then to uncover this big Tudor collection of everyday life.
It's fascinating the way in which the process of excavating her and raising her has become history itself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you were part of that, right?
Yeah, but also now you're getting to the stage that not everybody remembers the Mary Rose coming up, so it's not part of necessarily the younger people's history. So that's why we're trying to do this now, to have an immersive experience that will get that younger generation.
Julie, there's a personality somehow involved in these pieces.
There really is, yeah. It's like they talk to you, isn't it? I mean, for you and you it must be, but I mean, I'm just looking at them thinking, I'm just imagining them, you know, being used by the people on board, as you say, eating with the same knife as you stab someone. I just think it's absolutely fascinating.
And they were each one of these was made.
Yeah,
they're not factory.
No.
You know, they're
beautiful.
They're from the hand of people.
Yeah.
You know, objects contain absent people. It's that idea that each one of these represents someone who made it, owned it, used it.
Yeah.
And what we've done in the museum is where things were found with one individual, we've actually suggested the occupation of those individuals. So the things that were found in the carpenter's cabin and the body of a carpenter with objects relating to that on his skeleton are things that we've made big stories around. Could this be the carpenter? And then you can look at the analysis of the isotopes to see where he was born, etc.
It's just brilliant. I can't ever get enough of seeing these items. In fact, the more modest, the more humble, really, the more power they have. That's all for this week. Thanks to my guests, Andrew Bridgen, Dominic Jones, Alex Hildreth, and to Julie Cook. Next up, it's Calvin Robinson's Common Sense Crusade. I'll be back at the same time next week, and for the last few seconds, I'm just going to bask in the presence of living history.
Hello, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office. I'm Marco Pitagna. We hold on to fairly showery conditions across the UK over the next couple of days, but things will turn drier into next week as pressure starts to rise, and we'll see some warm sunshine at times too. Low pressure is generally in charge at the moment given these fairly showery conditions, but notice pressure rising there as we head into the early part of next week, and it's this that promises to bring the quieter conditions, certainly by Tuesday next week. Back to this evening, into the overnight period, showers from the word go out towards the west, and they'll develop elsewhere across the northern and western parts as we head into the early hours of Sunday. Some of those showers quite heavy, locally on the thundery side, with the clearest skies down towards the southeast and up towards the northeast. And here we'll see some fairly chilly conditions too. Temperatures close to freezing across a few spots towards the northeast of Scotland. As for Sunday itself, well, showers from the word go out towards the west, becoming more widespread as we go through the day. I think it's the southeast of England, best place to hold on to some bright weather throughout into the afternoon, whereas the showers out towards the west turning locally heavy and even thundery, particularly across parts of Northern Ireland. I think here we could see some quite torrential downpours into the afternoon. Temperatures doing well in the southeast in the sunshine, up to 18 or 19 degrees. Cooler though towards the northeast of Scotland. And heading into the evening, the showers tend to migrate their way eastwards across the UK. So we'll start to see some developing across the southeast of England. Fewer showers meanwhile developing out towards the northwest. So through Sunday night, some clearer spells developing here. But with fairly cloudy skies on the whole into the overnight period, those temperatures do hold up fairly well across the board, lows in the range 7 to 11 Celsius. As for Monday, well, a fair few showers are still expected across the east and southeast of England, a bit of showery rain too across the north of Scotland, but elsewhere, a quieter day on the whole, some bright or sunny spells developing, and temperatures still doing quite well for the time of year in that sunshine. as they will do as we head into Tuesday and Wednesday, with pressure starting to rise, plenty of fine weather to come, perhaps a bit more cloud towards the north of the UK heading into the middle part of the week. That's it. See you soon. Bye-bye.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.